The AmericasDemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, is made possible by contributions from our listeners. Want to do more? Go to AmericasDemocrats.org and click Donate. And thank you for allowing us to be your voice. And if you enjoy the show, please share it with your friends on Facebook and Twitter. This is AmericasDemocrats.org, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. How are the nation's intelligence professionals going to react to Trump's condemnation of them? CIA expert John Prados says the agency is headed for trouble. Seattle has raised the minimum wage to $15 an hour, and labor economist Sylvia Allegretto says it's working. And Salon editor David Daley discusses gerrymandering with Bill Press. Had enough of Fox News, the House Freedom Caucus, and Donald Trump? If you want the facts that you won't get from them or from the fake news sites of the alt-right, then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. National security author John Prados says the CIA is discrediting itself by failing to be accountable for its actions. And we say hello to John Prados, an author and analyst of national security issues based in Washington. In fact, he's the author of more than 20 books, including his new one, Ghosts of Langley, Into the CIA's Heart of Darkness. John Prados, thank you so much for joining us today on AmericasDemocrats.org.
My pleasure. It's good to be here.
Yes, and nice to have you with us. And for those who don't know, Langley is the location in Virginia, of course, of the CIA campus. So, John, what ghosts are there, and do they keep haunting us?
Well, yes and yes. First of all, of course, I'm using ghosts in the title of that book as a metaphor. It's the spirits of those officers who've worked for the CIA. But there are real ghosts, you know. Aside from everyone who has been involved in any kind of a controversial activity that the CIA has carried on, and that's my metaphorical ghost, there are people who were involved in controversial activities that fell dead in the middle of what they were doing, starting, of course, with infamously Bill Casey, who collapsed at his desk as the director of the Central Intelligence back in 1987. Then there's Desmond Fitzgerald. He was the chief of CIA operations. He was playing tennis outside in the summer of 1967 and collapsed on the tennis court. He died too. You could cite Bob Ames, who was one of the hotshot operators in the field and later a top analyst, who was blown up along with 6 other CIA officers in the U.S. Embassy in Beirut in 1983. As a matter of fact, as we speak today, the New York Times is carrying a story that reveals the names of 6 CIA officers killed in Iraq or Afghanistan during the war in those countries. So there are real ghosts in addition to the imagined ones, and there are also people outside the CIA who could very well be considered ghosts of Langley. So, for example, President John F. Kennedy. You know, I'm sitting here, in front of me is a document declassified just 2 months ago. It is a record of a top-level Washington meeting that was held about the Cuba anti-Castro program and which took place 10 days before Mr. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas in November of 1963. And in this meeting, the president listens to a discussion of the utility of sabotage operations against Cuba, and he personally approves the next set of operations to be conducted. And a few days later, he is assassinated, and that day till now, questions about was Castro involved in the death of Kennedy, or was Kennedy involved in operations against Castro, those things have swirled around the world, not only of U.S. politics and U.S. history, but intelligence history as well.
Mm-hmm. Now, from the title of your book, it would possibly suggest you're not the CIA's biggest fan. But as a national security expert, tell us what the agency does right and, of course, what it does wrong.
I would say that the CIA has long had a reputation as one of the most solid, in fact, analytical units in the intelligence world, and also a reputation as very innovative and unconventional in its development of mechanisms for collecting intelligence, technical intelligence in particular, research and development on intelligence collection mechanisms. Now, as it happens in today's world, today's world is moving away, actually, from the areas where CIA is strongest. That is, that the technical means that we use to track telephone calls and stuff like that are less useful in a world in which our adversaries communicate with notes on paper and by couriers going from one place to another. And as for the analytical capability, the Director of National Intelligence Office has absorbed the top level of CIA analytical expertise and taken it for itself, and the lower levels are actually threatened by internal reorganization within the agency, which is creating mission centers which draw off analytical capability in support of CIA operations. Operations now, that's an area where if you want to talk about what the CIA does less well, that is a big controversy about whether and how well the CIA does operations. The Cuba operation that I just referred to, this declassified document, is a classic example of a CIA operation gone bad. But in more recent history, the concern has been what we talk about as the, quote, militarization of the CIA. And that is that the use of the CIA in support of military operations has progressed to the point that, to a certain degree, military operations are absorbing CIA capabilities. So, for example, now you have the CIA sharing drone war attack missions with the military, and you have military assigned to the CIA for classic CIA paramilitary functions, and so on. And successive directors of the CIA have talked about getting the CIA away from this militarization and back into classical intelligence collection areas. But as far as we can tell from the outside, they've had little success doing that.
We're speaking with John Prados, analyst of national security issues based in Washington, also the author of more than 20 books, including his new one, Ghosts of Langley, Into the CIA's Heart of Darkness. John, even before Trump assumed office, he was critical of the CIA and the rest of the intelligence establishment. That seems kind of stupid to me, to offend the people who are responsible for advising you on foreign policy and who can theoretically destroy you. Would you agree with that?
Interesting question. Well, I would say yes and no. Sorry. Yes, it is definitely stupid to offend these people, and no doubt about it. But on the other hand, these people work for you, and the classical dilemma right now for a CIA intelligence officer is, do I stay and work for this wild man, or do I get out while the getting's good? And if I get out, what do I do then? So that's problematical. Equally problematic, though, is that the CIA is discrediting itself. And this is one of the themes in my book, Ghosts of Langley, where by means of decoupling itself from accountability mechanisms that have applied in the past, the Central Intelligence Agency set it up for a situation where it is discredited. Last year, when the whole business about Russian intervention in the U.S. election came up, the then CIA director, John Brennan, made efforts to actually bring this issue to the Congress and to get them to pay attention to it, and they paid no attention to him. And one of the big reasons for that, I think, is that he cut them off at the knees when they tried to investigate the CIA torture program.
Now, what about the, do you think that President Trump was in cahoots with Putin all along and wants to be in the future?
That's a good question, and the jury is still out, obviously. I'm not sure that we're going to get to the bottom of this anytime soon. But my guess is that Mr. Trump was desperate to win, was willing to do anything that it cost to win, saw cooperation with the Russians somehow as helping him in that endeavor, and went along with it. Now, what we've learned more recently about Mr. Trump's business dealings in Moscow and his desires to actually do business in Russia raises the question of ulterior motives that he might have extending into the present. And some suspicion of that is consistent with his continuing, reluctance to treat the Russians as a standard other country, rather than the kind of obsequiousness which he continues to give to them. So I don't know, and it's a real question.
What do you see as the future of the agency under Trump?
I believe that the CIA is headed for trouble. I think, as I referred to the agency decoupling itself from accountability, I think that the old elements that served to protect the agency when it got into trouble have been dismantled. The new president that it's obliged to serve is inclined to shoot from the hip. He's very excitable. He's ready to order out the troops on a moment's notice, and they're going to be, they being the CIA, are going to be under pressure to make moves in situations where they may have no or little real capability. North Korea being a case in point, for example. Suppose Mr. Trump wakes up tomorrow morning and orders up a CIA covert operation to eliminate all North Korean nuclear weapons. I'm sure I am confident, although I have no means of knowing this, that the CIA doesn't have the capability to do that. But it also is in a position where how can it say no to the president? So it's heading for trouble, and when it hits trouble, there's not going to be any safety net.
Given his whole attitude and his actions to this point, do you think Trump wants to set up an alternative private spying apparatus the way dictators often do?
I don't think so, actually. My sense of Mr. Trump is that he believes he doesn't need information. Let's go back to World War II for a minute, just to take an opposite example. The Japanese in World War II, they had an intelligence organization, and they felt that the purpose of their intelligence organization wasn't so much to tell them about the enemy and to take care of the enemy. It was to demonstrate to themselves the greatness of the obstacle that they faced, and therefore the immense achievements that they had obtained by success against that object. And my feeling for what Mr. Trump believes about intelligence is more along that line. Mr. Trump wants the CIA to tell him how great he is when he's victorious against North Korea, as opposed to telling him what is actually the dimension of the North Korean threat.
John Prados, author, analyst of national security issues based here in Washington. In fact, he's the author of more than 20 books, including his new one, Ghosts of Langley, Into the CIA's Heart of Darkness, joining us today on americasdemocrats.org. John, we appreciate your time with us today and do look forward to having you back again soon.
Great, thank you.
You're quite welcome. And this is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen to this americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats. But we need you to stand up and fight. You want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.
This Social Security measure, I believe that we must pass legislation to provide medical care.
This is our tradition. When our grandparents came to America, it was the Democratic Party which said, welcome. It was the Democratic Party, the party of Roosevelt and Truman and Kennedy and others, who said that America belonged to all its people, not just a handful of the rich or a few giant corporations. That's why great leaders like FDR fought so hard for Social Security, and why JFK stood up to the insurance companies and their Republican allies to get Medicare. It's not just one thing, or one time, in one place. It's about a whole history of standing up to the Republicans and saying someone has to be on the side of regular working people in America, whether it's defending Social Security or just the way your loved ones are treated on the job. That's what the Democratic Party is all about. And that's why this message has been brought to you by the Democratic Party. Working people like you and me.
Paid for by 21st Century Democrats. Not authorized by any candidate or candidates committee. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Labor economist Sylvia Allegretto says the $15 an hour minimum wage is working in the city of Seattle without job losses predicted by opponents. We'll talk to her about that in just a moment. Right now, we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his common sense commentary.
You know what's wrong with American politics? It's that there just aren't enough ways for giant corporations and mega-rich political donors to funnel their big bucks into our elections and buy our government. At least that's what Donald Trump, the Republican Party, and a devious group of right-wing political pastors are saying. And, of course, they've got a diabolical fix for this, quote, problem. Their scheme is to turn tax-exempt, far-right churches into gushing sewers of political money, secretly channeling unlimited amounts of cash from corporations and right-wing extremists through the churches into the campaigns of politicians who'll do their bidding. They don't admit this, of course, instead wrapping their scheme in the pious rhetoric of religious freedom. Their point of attack is the Johnson Amendment, a 1954 law passed by LBJ that prohibits tax-exempt charities, including churches, from endorsing candidates, funding campaigns, and directly engaging in politics. The Alliance Defending Freedom, an extremist Christian operation pushing repeal of Johnson's amendment, asserts that banning churches from overt political campaigning lets the IRS, quote, tell pastors what they can and cannot preach. Clever, but totally dishonest. First, the issue is not whether the government can tell church groups what to say. It can't. But whether taxpayers should subsidize a church group's electioneering views and activities. Second, and most diabolical, repealing the Johnson ban would turn these churches into holy temples of dark money. Special interest funders would rush to these political, quote, charities, not only because the churches would be super-secret super PACs, but churches are tax-exempt, meaning the donors would also be blessed with a tax deduction for their corrupting campaign contributions. This is Jim Hightower saying taxpayers would be underwriting the corruption of American politics. How ungodly is that?
Hightower's commentaries are brought to you by the Hightower Lowdown, the monthly newsletter with Hightower's take on what Wall Street and Washington are up to. For information, visit hightowerlowdown.org.
This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Sylvia Allegretto, a labor economist, studied the effect of raising the minimum wage in Seattle and says it's working there without causing job losses. And we say hello to Sylvia Allegretto, a labor economist and co-chair of the Center on Wage and Employment Dynamics at the University of California, Berkeley. She's also the co-author of a recent report on the effect of a minimum wage increase in Seattle. Sylvia Allegretto, thank you so much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org.
Well, it's good to be here. Thanks for having me.
Oh, you're quite welcome. It's nice to have you with us. The city of Seattle is one of the first to raise the minimum wage in stages to $15. You and your colleagues have just done a study on the effects. What did you find?
Well, first of all, we're only looking at the first two phase-ins that went, the first phase-in to 11 and then to 13. The city did go to 15 for large businesses in January of this year, but we don't have the data for that as of yet. So this is effectively an interim report. But what we found so far is that it looks like it's working the way it should, which they wanted to increase the earnings of low-wage workers, and we do find that, especially in highly affected industries such as the restaurant industry. But we haven't seen any negative effects on employment.
Does focusing on the fast food industry fairly reflect the overall effect of a minimum wage increase?
Well, we didn't just focus on the fast food. We focused on limited service fast food. We also looked at full service restaurants and food services even much more broadly. So the reason why we look at that is because restaurants, especially limited service, are heavy users of low wage and minimum wage workers, very intense users. So if you're going to see an effect, you would hope to see an effect there.
Right, it's going to start there before anywhere else.
That's right. So if you don't see an effect there, then you wouldn't expect to see effect where in industries that also use low-wage workers, such as retail, for instance, but not as heavily, not as intensely. Our future reports will be looking at other industries beyond food service.
All right. Now, opponents say that while some people will be helped by higher wages, more people will lose their jobs because employers can't afford wide-scale pay raises. Do we know the extent of job loss at this point, given that it is just an interim report?
Well, again, my report and the data that I ran and my empirical evidence shows that thus far we do not detect any loss of employment, any major employment differences. And again, we don't know when or if that may happen. Certainly, we know that minimum wages of $50 an hour are going to definitely have some negative effects, but that's not a policy anybody's actually pursuing. And as of now, going to $13, which isn't that far out of the historic norm, really. And some of my other research has looked at minimum wage changes for the past 30 years, for instance. And in that work, we also have shown that there hasn't been negative employment effects associated with minimum wages. Of course, these wages are going to, at least at some point with the phase-ins, such as Seattle and other cities, going to go beyond what we have seen before. And that's why we're going to study each and every city independently.
Well, and of course, and then what the proponents would say is that as you give lower wage workers more money, then they have more money to spend on things like going out to eat for themselves or going to the movies and things like that. Can you look at that kind of data right now and see that that's actually working? So kind of going at it from the other direction?
Well, again, we did look at wage effects. So if you assume, and I do, that low-wage workers, if you put more money into their hands, they will spend it. They have high propensities to spend, right, consumption. If you give them more monies, we do see an effect on wages. So we see a positive and effect on wages for these low-wage workers. So I don't have data on their consumption habits, but I think it's fair to assume that they're out there spending that extra money.
Sure. I remember just one of my earliest jobs working as a clerk in a store, and when it came to payday, I was counting on going out to lunch, not bringing my lunch with me, and so I would assume that effect would be there. Now, looking at Seattle specifically, in general, it's a higher wage, high economy city. So does measuring the effects of a minimum wage reflect reality nationally? I mean, aren't most workers already paid more than the minimum?
Well, first, absolutely most workers in the economy throughout the U.S. are paid more than the minimum wage, which is a good thing. But having said that, the minimum wage workers that we have, for instance, today in general across the U.S. on average, are making less than minimum wage workers made 30 or 40 years ago, which, by the way, is important to remember. Why are we talking so much about the minimum wage? Why is minimum wage in the news? Why are all these cities and states passing higher minimum wages? I mean, we can't lose sight of why we're in this policy debate to begin with, and that is because we've had long-term trends of stagnating at best and declining at worst wages for our low-wage workforce. And this is in the context of decades and an ever-expanding economic pie, increasing productivity by ever more educated workforce, even these low-wage workers, especially compared to their 1960s counterpart, but they're making less money. That doesn't make any sense. So you go one step further and say, well, how can we have all this more, such a bigger economic pie? Well, of course, this plays right into one of the biggest narratives coming out of the Great Recession is vast and ever-increasing inequality. So you have to always kind of keep your eye on the context of these policy decisions. And so, yes, most workers are not paid the minimum wage. That's good. But, we had the $7.25 is the federal minimum wage. It's been the federal minimum wage since 2009. And when we know historically when the federal minimum wage lags for long periods of time, like it is now, that you see more action at the state and now at the city and local levels.
We're speaking with Sylvia Allegretto, labor economist and co-chair of the Center on Wage and Employment Dynamics at the University of California, Berkeley. She is also co-author of a recent report on the effect of a minimum wage increase in Seattle. Is there legitimacy to the argument, Sylvia, that if we didn't mandate minimum wages but improve the overall economy in other ways, employers would compete for labor and raise wages?
Well, first of all, like I just said, I mean, we have had long periods of booming economies where the wages of our lowest wage workers in real terms, after adjusting for price increases, have actually been declining. So there's very little evidence in our long-term economic history that workers are, if you will, gaining their fair share of an ever-increasing economic pie. And with the decline of unions, union densities, and the institutions that make sure that workers would normally get their fair share, no, we don't see that an expanding economic pie is necessarily going to get more money into the hands of the low-wage workforce. But I think we need to do both. I mean, we need to pursue full employment policies. We need to keep wages reasonable. Again, I don't think $7.25 an hour this day and age is a reasonable minimum wage for our lowest wage workers. But we also want to make sure that they can find jobs and that we have a good, solid, and robust labor force and economy. But what happens is, especially as you recall, in 2008 and 2009, when the economy imploded and millions of people lost their jobs, these low-wage workers, and matter of fact, not even just low-wage workers, even middle workers, are still feeling the effects of that. This implosion of where we had unemployment reach double digits for a long period of time. So it would be great to pursue full employment policies, and when the economy tanks, that we have the government step in and make sure that those who are losing their jobs can keep their jobs, or that the economy is the employer of last resort, and all those types of policies. But in the end, what we've seen in an ever-expanded, growing, and wealthy economies, one of the most wealthy economies in the world, that we have a good share of workers falling further and further behind, which just doesn't make any sense to me and is not good economic policy for low-wage workers, for their families, for those communities.
Yeah, absolutely, and I what I don't understand is why that's not more universally seen and believed. There are, of course, other cities raising the minimum wage. Do we know anything yet about how that has worked in other places other than Seattle?
Well, we're in the midst of analyzing all the recent minimum wages that have passed in states like California and New York, and also the citywide minimum wages that have passed, by and large, above $12 an hour, and they're all going through certain phase-ins. You have Los Angeles, San Francisco, Chicago, New York, and we will have reports coming out intermittently. Again, the phase-in schedules are all different, and we have to wait for, because there's always a lag in the data that are available. But we'll be putting out intermittent reports over the next, 4 or 5 years, studying all of these phase-ins as they happen and as real time as possible.
Okay. Sylvia Allegretto, labor economist, co-chair of the Center on Wage and Employment Dynamics at the University of California, Berkeley, co-author of the report we've been talking about that was studying the effect of the minimum wage increase in Seattle, joining us today on americasdemocrats.org. Sylvia, thank you so much for your time. We do look forward to having you back again with us soon.
You're very welcome.
All right, and this is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to keep the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, on the air, and help elect stand-up Democrats. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. And now Bill Press talks with David Daley of Salon.
Let's get into reapportionment, because that was the subject of your book.
Absolutely.
Such an important book. But it does bubble up now to the Supreme Court next week.
This is huge. This is the big potential game changer that could give us back our democracy, Bill.
You're counting on the John Roberts court?
Well, I'm counting on Anthony Kennedy. This is a 4-4 court right now, and Anthony Kennedy has in the past said, show me a standard on partisan gerrymandering, and I will consider it. Well, it's been 14 years since the topic of partisan gerrymandering reached the Supreme Court. There is now an amazing case. This is called Gill versus Whitford. It comes out of the redistricting cycle after the 2010 census in Wisconsin. We all know what happened in 2010. Republicans had a deep and serious strategy called the Red Map for redistricting majority project, and their goal was to flip state legislative chambers across the country, lock Democrats out of the room, and when it came time to draw all of the new state legislative and congressional lines, and then use the amazing new technology and big data that's available to draw themselves completely unbeatable districts at the state level and at the national level. This is fundamentally the reason why in a 50-50 country in which Democrats usually get more votes, Republicans have all the power in Washington and control 69 of 99 state legislative chambers.
That's how important it is. You're
This
absolutely right.
is the key. This is why Democrats get more votes, but Republicans keep all the power. So this Whitford case, it comes out of the 2012 election in Wisconsin, the first election run on these maps. Democrats get 174,000 more votes. Republicans take 60 of the 99 seats. It's only gotten worse over the course of this decade. Republicans now have 65 of the 99 seats in this chamber. And the state, wants a real competitive state.
Yeah.
In 2016, these assembly districts are so lopsided that there was not even a major party candidate put forth in 49% of these races. This is what gerrymandering does to our democracy. It strips us of competitive and meaningful elections, and it takes away our choice.
Oh, so who brought this case to the Supreme Court?
A handful of plaintiffs in Wisconsin, voters in the state, who were outraged over what happened. And these are regular citizens. So as soon as folks start talking about how there's nothing I can do about partisan gerrymandering, well, there is. These are a dozen retirees and former college professors who started sitting around a tea room in Wisconsin, and they were talking very frustrated about the election and the results and the state of their state. And they are now on the doorstep of the Supreme Court of the United States On Tuesday, there will be oral arguments heard in this case. Essentially, it goes back to the last time that partisan gerrymandering was in front of the court. And that's a case out of Pennsylvania called the Veith case in 2004.
So what can the court do? Can the court say you have to redraw, these lines are
they most
skewed,
certainly can.
And you have to redraw
A lower
them?
district court has already ordered new maps in Wisconsin.
But who would draw the new maps?
Well, what they said was that it would have to be done under court supervision, and if the court did not approve of those maps, then the court would step in and draw new maps themselves.
But do we want these new maps? So I guess should state legislators be the ones drawing the maps? Because no matter whether they're Democratic-controlled legislature or Republican-controlled, they certainly have. They
That's
help
absolutely
themselves.
right.
Yeah.
The foxes should not be guarding hen houses.
Okay.
Politicians should not be drawing their own districts and choosing their own voters. Every other a democratic country in the world does a better job than this than we do. They use some forms of independent commissions or proportional.
How many states have done that so far?
About 10.
Mm-hmm. California being one of them.
California being one. And some of them work and some of them don't. I mean, some of these independent commissions are really just incumbent protection rackets dressed up under another name. But the problem here is that the High Court has never once in our history weighed in and established a constitutional standard on this.
Yeah.
And Kennedy, in the Veith case, the last time this comes up, says, I am open to a clear and manageable standard if you can show me one. I don't see it in this case. So he sides with Scalia and the conservative bloc in a 5-4 case that turns down the Pennsylvania case. But he sets loose all of these stats professors and poli-sci nerds
so you still think
looking for a standard.
You still think he has an open mind?
He has an open mind. He has asked for a standard, and there is one called the efficiency gap, which essentially measures the number of wasted votes that do not contribute to a win by either side. It's essentially 6th grade math, and it's clear enough even for a judge, Bill.
What a test! But so the implications are that I guess if the court comes down the right way, the way we believe they should, and let's say in favor of democratically reflected or democracy, right?
Yes,
and fair districts, drawing of districts. Would it have implications beyond Wisconsin?
Absolutely, because there are all of these other states: Ohio, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Florida, Texas.
Then all
you
states
would see
have to
legislation in these
model
states the next day.
Yeah,
and there is no one case out there right now that could impact our democracy in quite this way. And we are also right on the verge of the 2020 cycle, so we are not far off from all of this redistricting happening again after the 2020 census. Republicans have huge majorities in all of these state houses. Republicans will be controlling the pen in all of these purple swing states as this next process ensues. So if there is a constitutional standard that comes down from the court, at least there will be restrictions on how far they can go. It could put an end to this extreme gerrymandering.
Okay, now, we've had Democrat after Democrat come in, including the Associate Chair of the Democratic National Committee, Jamie Harrison, who was here right where you're sitting yesterday, saying that, meanwhile, the Democrats are not depending on the court, that they're out there to take back these state legislatures so that they do control most of them by the 2020 cycle. Do you see evidence of that?
Why don't you ask them who's running against Frank Lobiondo in New Jersey, too? A district that Trump took by fewer than 5 points, that Obama won by 8 points.
But
no Democratic challenger in that district. Ask them who's running against John Katko in New York 24, a district Hillary won by 4 points. Where is the Democratic challenger there? Where is the New York challenger against Lee Zeldin in New York 1? in Washington's 3rd, and a couple of winnable Florida seats in the 18th and 19th district. You've got all the Democrats down there flocking to run in the open seat created by the retirement of Elena Rose-Lehtinen, and there's no Democratic challengers yet in the 18th and the 19th. Democrats need to take 24 seats to win control. It is really uphill. It's going to be even harder if these winnable districts don't get credible candidates fast.
But these are districts that there are some 24 or 20 or more.
These were districts that were on their target list.
But Hillary won, but they're represented by Republicans, right?
You've got
those are the target districts?
They are targeting about 50 districts,
mm-hmm.
but the key 23 districts they're targeting are districts that were won by Hillary but represented by a Republican. The trouble with a lot of those seats is that only 4 of those were within double digits in 2016. So while they look like they are good targets, if you're the Triple C, if you're an ambitious Democrat looking to run for office, it's not exactly a close race. So it's hard to get challengers here.
You mentioned there was the red map. That was 2010?
Yes.
Okay. Is there a blue map strategy?
Yes, there is indeed. Democrats have something called the National Democratic Redistricting Commission. This is the brainchild of Barack Obama, who has said that redistricting is going to be his top political priority.
Led with Eric Holder?
Exactly. This is the Holder Group.
Right.
They are on the move a little bit. That they raised $11 million so far this year. Most of it keyed off of a big fundraiser by Barack Obama. And they just announced last week their first major donation. They're dropping $500,000 into the key Virginia governor's race this year, and that race matters very, very much. It's the most important race in America this year because if Republicans win it, they will have a trifecta in that state, meaning the governor's office and both houses of the state legislature. They will control redistricting in that state in 2021 because the governor who's elected in 2017 will be over that process, and you can forget about Virginia for the Democrats for the next
And what are the Republicans doing in response?
Well, there you go. The Republicans had been pretty quiet as far as a national organization on this until yesterday when they announced the National Republican Redistricting Trust, and they budget $35 million toward it. So on day one,
they're going to have
3 times
as much
what
money
the Democrats have managed to raise so far. So this is an uphill fight, but it is a crucial fight. The court is very important, but you never know whether Justice Kennedy is going to see in the efficiency gap and some of the other standards that have been brought before him a clear and meaningful guide that can be applied.
So this has to happen, and is happening, I guess, on at least 3 fronts.
Exactly.
You've got the Supreme Court, you've got the congressional targeting for 2018, and also you've got the state legislative and governor's races.
Let me add governors to that.
Yeah.
These governor's races in Virginia, and then next year in Michigan, in Ohio, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Florida, the most important races for Democrats in the country.
That's all for americasdemocrats.org. Thank you to all who made today's show possible. John Prados, Sylvia Allegretto, and the entire Bill Press team. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook. For americasdemocrats.org, I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us. Support the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.